Lecture 3, Cognitive Linguistics. Cognitive linguistics is an interdisciplinary branch of linguistics combining knowledge and research from cognitive science, cognitive psychology, neuropsychology, and linguistics. Cognitive linguistics, as the approach to the study of language, began to emerge in the 1970s and has been increasingly active since the 1980s. Cognitive linguistics argues that language is governed by general cognitive principles rather than by a special-purpose language module. There are three major hypotheses guiding the cognitive linguistic approach to language. Language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty. Grammar is conceptualization. Knowledge of language emerges from language use. These three hypotheses represent a response to the pioneering figures in cognitive linguistics, to the dominant approaches to syntax and semantics at the time, namely generative grammar and truth-conditional logical semantics. Frame semantics. What is it that words denote or symbolize, as cognitive linguists usually put it? A simple assumption as that guided much research in semantics is that words denote concepts, units of meaning. Concepts symbolized by words such as stallion and mare can be compared and contrasted with one another. Comparisons of words is the approach taken by structural semantics, which analyzes types of semantic relations between words, including hyponymy and antonymy. Some approaches to lexical semantics have proposed that word concepts such as stallion and mare are not atomic. Many concepts can be broken down into semantic features so that stallion is equine, male, and mare is equine, female. Finally, in the logical tradition that underlies much work in semantics, concepts are ultimately defined by their truth conditions, the conditions under which one can say that a concept does or does not appropriately apply to a situation in the world. In this widespread approach to semantics, it is recognized that concepts do not simply float around randomly in the mind. First, there are the relations between words and their corresponding concepts described by structural semantics. But there has been a strong feeling that concepts are organized in another way as well. Certain concepts belong together because they are associated in experience. To use a classical example, Shank and Abelson, 1977, a restaurant is not merely a service institution. It has associated with it a number of concepts such as customer, waiter, ordering, eating, bill. These concepts are not related to restaurant by hyponymy, meronymy, antonymy, or other structural semantic relations. They are related to restaurant by ordinary human experience. The concept restaurant is closely tied to the other concepts and cannot be isolated from the other concepts. The need for another means for organizing concepts has been felt by researchers in cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence, as well as in various branches of linguistics, and has led to a variety of similar proposals, each typically with its own name. Among these names are frame, schema, script, global pattern, pseudo-text, cognitive model, experiential gestalt, base, scene. Fillmore, 1985. The most influential versions of this proposal in cognitive linguistics has been the model of frame semantics developed by Fillmore. Fillmore views frames not as an additional means for organizing concepts, but as fundamental rethinking of the goals of linguistic semantics. Fillmore describes his frame semantic model as a model of the semantics of understanding, in contrast to a truth-conditional semantics, the full, rich understanding that a speaker intends to convey in a text and that a hearer constructs for that text. Fillmore argues that in the analysis of linguistic meaning, understanding is the primary data. Truth-value judgments and judgments of the semantic relations, such as synonymy and implication, are derivative and theory-driven. Fillmore's frame semantics brings linguistic semantics back to the primary data and does not exclude any of it from consideration. Fillmore uses a tool metaphor to describe the understanding process. A speaker produces words and constructions in a text as tools for a particular activity, namely, to evoke a particular understanding. The hearer's task is to figure out the activity those tools were intended for, namely, to invoke that understanding. That is, words and constructions evoke an understanding, or more specifically, a frame. A hearer evokes a frame upon hearing an utterance in order to understand it. Fillmore uses a wide range of examples to demonstrate that there are significant phenomena in linguistic semantics that cannot easily be captured in a model of structural semantics, semantic features, and/or truth-conditional semantics. We survey his arguments here. The analysis of semantic features is often justified on the basis of lexical sets that appear to be analyzable in terms of a simple set of features. For example, the lexical set can be analyzed in terms of the features male, female, adult, young, and unmarried. Male, female, man, woman, adult, boy, girl, young, bachelor, spinster, unmarried. Yet our understanding of these concepts is more complex than this paradigm of features contrasts implies. The relation between man-boy and woman-girl is not the same for many people. The term girl is used for female humans at a significantly higher rate than the term for boy is used for male humans. Moreover, the attitudes toward the sexes that this linguistic behavior is assumed to evoke has led to changes in the relationship and hypercorrection such that the term woman is attested as being applied even to an 8-year-old girl. In a frame semantic analysis, man, boy, woman, and girl evoke frames that include not just the biological sexual distinction, but also differences in attitudes and behavior between the sexes that would explain the traditional asymmetry in the use of boy-girl and the more recent change in the use of woman, including its hypercorrective use. Likewise, the difference between our understanding of bachelor and our understanding of spinster involves much more than a simple feature, male, female. Many lexical contrasts contain a semantic asymmetry that cannot be captured by features except in ad hoc fashion, but lend themselves easily to a frame semantic account. For example, the opposing terms used to the vertical extent of an erect human being are tall and short. For a vertical distance from a bottom baseline, for example, branch of a tree, they are high and low. But for the vertical dimension of a building, they are tall and low. Fillmore, 1977. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a unitary feature definition of tall that captured all its different contexts of use from high and did the same for short versus low. Instead, one can simply describe the frames for humans, buildings, and other objects, and specify which words are used for vertical extent or distance in that frame. Fillmore's arguments present a wide range of data that justify the introduction of frames to the analysis of linguistic semantics and the replacement of the truth-conditional semantics with the semantics of understanding. Concepts, profile, frame organization. In cognitive linguistics, frame is understood as a coherent region of human knowledge or as a coherent region of conceptual space. The question immediately arises, how does one identify a coherent region of conceptual space? differentiating it from other regions. And a priori approach to this question, using one's own intuitions to identify frames, would be highly subjective. A more empirical approach to this question is to identify frames based on the words and constructions of a human language such as English. This approach is taken by Langecker, 1987, which we will use as our starting point. Langecker illustrates his approach to the problem with the meaning of the word radius. The word form radius denotes the concept radius. We begin here by assuming that concepts correspond to meanings of linguistic units, words, complex expressions, or constructions. One may also assume that concepts exist that do not correspond to linguistic meanings. However, one would have the same problems trying to identify concepts independent of linguistic meanings as trying to identify frames independent of linguistic meanings, namely the lack of empirical basis to do so. For this reason, we will restrict ourselves to concepts corresponding to actual linguistic meanings. The first sense for radius in the American Heritage Dictionary is a line segment that joins the center of the circle with any point on its circumference. A radius is a line segment, but not any line segment. The line segment is defined relative to the structure of the circle. In other words, one can understand radius only against a background understanding of the concept circle, which can be geometrically illustrated. In other words, the concept radius and circle are intimately related, and this relationship must be represented in conceptual structure. Langecker describes the relationship between radius and circle as one of a concept profile against a base. The profile refers to the concept symbolized by the word in question. The base is that knowledge or conceptual structure that is presupposed by the profiled concept. Langecker also uses the term domain for the base. This term is also used by Lakoff. This is identical to Fillmore's frame. By the term frame, I have in mind any system of concepts related in such a way that to understand any one of them, you have to understand the whole structure in which it fits. The term profile has also come to be used as a verb to describe the relationship between word form and word meaning. Profile plus base. For example, radius profiles a particular line segment in the circle. Base, domain, frame. A concept profile is insufficient to define a word concept because it presupposes other knowledge in its definition, namely its base. But a single base, such as a circle, is a complex conceptual structure that includes a wide range of concept profiles such as radius, arc, center, diameter, chord, and so on. Hence, the base alone is insufficient to define a linguistic concept either. The conclusion that follows from this is that the meaning of a linguistic unit must specify both the profile and its base. This is identical to Fillmore's conclusion regarding concept frames. The fact that a base supports multiple concept profiles is what makes the base a domain. In the intuitive sense, several different concepts profiles have its own base. We can now define a domain as a semantic structure that functions as the base for at least one concept profile, typically many profiles. As Taylor, 1989, notes, in principle, any conceptualization or knowledge configuration, no matter how simple or complex, can serve as the cognitive domain for the characterization of meaning. We may now say that domain circle includes the concept of an arc, a diameter, a radius, a chord, and so on. In fact, no concept exists autonomously. All are understood to fit into our general knowledge of the world in one way or another. What matters for semantic analysis is the profile-based relations and the relationships between bases and domains. Much more complex is the elaboration of the relationships among domains, not surprisingly, since this touches on the organization of human knowledge in mind. An important fact about profiles, frames, and domains is that one can have successive chains of profile-frame relations. The concept radius can only be understood in terms of circle, but the concept circle can itself only be understood in terms of two-dimensional space. That is, the word circle profiles circle against the space frame. In other words, a concept that functions as the frame domain for other concepts is itself a profile for another conceptual frame domain. In other words, whether a conceptual structure is the profile or frame domain is a matter of construal. The chain of profile-frame relations does eventually bottom out. When we reach directly embodied human experience, space is a good candidate for a directly embodied human experience. Langacke calls domains rooted in directly embodied human experience basic domains. He calls non-basic domains abstract domains. A major theme of Langacke and Johnson's cognitive linguistic research is that even our most abstract knowledge is ultimately grounded in directly embodied human experience. Other examples of basic domains besides space are material, time, force, and a host of perceptual and bodily sensations, color, hotness, loudness, hunger, pain. There are also emotional and other mental states and processes, and also social properties, relations, and processes that do not presuppose other domains. The relationship between an abstract domain and the basic domain it presupposes is not a taxonomic relation, or as Langacke calls such relations, schematic one. It is a relationship of concept to background assumption or presuppositions. This distinction is sometimes obscured by English language. For example, the word shape as a mass noun stands for domain, but as a count noun, a shape, it is a more general or schematic concept subsuming circle, square, triangle, and so on. A more general or schematic concept is not the domain for the particular concept. In fact, a schematic concept is itself profiled in the same domain as its instantiation. Langacke argues that some domains involve more than one dimension. An obvious case is space, which involves three dimensions. Some concepts, such as circle, need only two dimensions for their definition. Others, such as line, need only one. Many physical qualities that are grounded in the experience of sensory perception, such as temperature and pitch, are one-dimensional. Others, such as color, can be divided into hue, brightness, and saturation. Generally, dimensions of a domain are all simultaneously presupposed by concepts profiled in the domain. This is the critical point. A concept may presuppose several different dimensions at once. In fact, a concept may presuppose be profiled in several different domains. For example, a human being must be defined relative to the domains of physical objects, living things, and volitional agents, and several other domains, for example, emotions. The combination of domains simultaneously presupposed by a concept such as human being is called a domain matrix. Langacke makes the important point that there is, in principle, only a difference of degree between dimensions of a domain and domains in a matrix. In practice, we are more likely to call a semantic structure a domain if there are a substantial number of concepts profiled relative to that structure. If there are few, if any concept profiled relative to that structure alone, but instead there are concepts profiled relative to that structure and other one, then those structures are likely to be called two dimensions of a single domain. The term domain implies a degree of cognitive independence not found in a dimension. The domain structure presupposed by a concept can be extremely complex. Let us now consider how one would define what seems to be a kind of physical object, the letter T. It is directly defined as a letter of the alphabet. Its base domain is hence the alphabet. The alphabet is itself an abstract domain presupposing the notion of writing system. It is not just an instance of a writing system, since the latter involves not just a set of symbols, such as an alphabet, but also the means of putting them together, including the direction of letters on a page, spaces for words, and so on. The domain of writing systems in turn presupposes the activity of writing. The activity of writing must be defined in terms of human communication, which presupposes the notion of meaning, perhaps a basic domain, since the symbolic relation appears not to be reducible to some other relation, and visual sensations, since writing is communication via visually perceived inscriptions rather than auditory or through gestures. And since writing is an activity, the domains of time and force or causation, both basic domains, are also involved in the domain matrix of writing, since the letter T is the product of an activity. Since writing is a human activity, it presupposes the involvement of human beings. Human beings are living things with mental abilities such as volition, intention, cognition, and emotion, themselves dimensions of the mental domain or better domain in the matrix of the domain of the mind. Living things in the turn are physical objects endowed with life. Physical objects possess material existence and are spatial entities, although material objects always have spatial extent. Spatial objects like geometric figures can exist without material embodiment. A diagram exhibiting all the basic abstract domain relations presupposed in the defining the concept of letter T based on the work of the Croft 1993 is given here. From this, it can be seen that it is incorrect to describe the concept of the letter T simply as belonging to the domain of writing, as a typical informal theory of domains would most likely to have it. The vast majority of concepts belong to abstract domains, which are themselves profiled in complex domain matrices, often also abstract, and so ultimately presuppose a large array of basic domains that can be called a domain structure. Croft 1993. This corresponds to Langacker's maximal scope. It is not easy to distinguish profile-based relations from taxonomic schematic relations, that is, type versus instance. For example, is writing an instance of human communication, or is writing an instance of an activity that can only be understood in terms of the goals of human communication? It is also to determine direct versus indirect reference to a domain. The definition of an arc does not directly presuppose two-dimensional space, but rather it presupposes a circle, which in turn presupposes two-dimensional space. Thus, an arc is not directly a two-dimensional object per se, but only such by virtue of being a part of a circle. Likewise, the letter T is not directly a shape, but only such by virtue of being a letter of an alphabet. But in fact, is the letter T a shape by virtue of being a letter of the alphabet, or by virtue of being the physical product of the activity of writing? Figure with letter T assumes that it is best described as the former, since the set of symbols is a set of shapes. Another similar problem in this example is the location of the domain of mental ability. The activity of writing is volitional, intentional activity, so it presupposes the domain of mental ability. But mental ability is presupposed by writing because writing presupposes human involvement, and the human involvement involves volition and intention. Determining the exact structure of the array of domains upon which a profile concept is based requires a careful working out of the definitions of concepts. A further complication in the relation between profiles and domain matrices is that a word sometimes profiles a concept in only one of the domains of the domain matrix, or even just a domain deeply nested in the domain structure. The contrast can be illustrated by concepts person and body. Person is profiled against the abstract domain of human being, along with man, woman. The concept of human being is in turn profiled against the domain matrix of living thing, plus mind. Human beings are living things with certain mental states and abilities. Recall the classical definition of a man as a rational animal. Living thing is in turn profiled against the domains of physical object and life. Living things are physical objects endowed with life. The concept body represents a person's ability, reality, alive or dead. Its base is nevertheless still the abstract domain of human being, or more precisely animal, but it profiles just the physical object domain in the domain structure underlying human beings. Contrast body and soul, which profile a non-physical domain of human being, what we have called mind for convenience, or with corpse, which profiles the physical object domain, but also profiles a particular region of the life domain, namely dead. The act of categorization is one of the most basic human cognitive activities. Categorization involves the apprehension of some individual entity, some particular of experience, as an instance of something conceived more abstractly than there also encompasses of the actual and potential instantiation. For instance, a specific animal can be construed as an instantiation of the species dog, a specific patch of color as a manifestation of the property red, and so on. We shall call this abstract mental construct a conceptual category. Conceptual categories can be regarded as cognitive tools and are usually credited with a number of general functions. Learning. Experiences never recur exactly. Our ability to learn from past experience would be severely impaired if we could not relate the present to similar aspects of past experience, that is, by putting them into the same conceptual categories. Planning. The formulation of goals and plans to achieve them also requires knowledge to be dissociated from the individuals and packaged into concepts characterizing categories of entities. Communication. Language works in terms of generalities, that is, in terms of categories. Any linguistic expression, however detailed, in the end represents only a category of reference. Economy. Knowledge does not all need to be related to individual members. A significant amount can be stored in relation to groups of individuals. New knowledge gained on the basis of interaction with one or more individuals can be easily generalized to other members of category. Conversely, knowing on the basis of a limited number of criteria that an individual belongs to a particular category can give access to a much wider range of information about the individual. Frames. Frames, an idealized cognitive model, in some cases clusters of idealized cognitive models are represented by Fillmore and Lankoff as more or less invariant structures having a stable association with lexical items which allow for variable boundary construal, presumably in terms of the goodness or fit required between perceived reality and aspects of the frame. However, although the frame may be relatively more stable than the boundaries, the dynamic construal approach allows also for variable construal of the frame itself. Prospects of the cognitive linguistics. The contemporary movement of cognitive linguistics began largely as an approach to the analysis of linguistic meaning and grammatical form in response to the truth-conditional semantics and generative grammar. We focus on the analysis of syntax and semantics in cognitive linguistics based on the three fundamental hypotheses presented. Language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty, grammar is conceptualization, and knowledge of language emerges from language use. However, these basic hypotheses have consequences beyond the narrow confines of linguistics and also the narrow confines of the mental representation of linguistic knowledge. A number of cognitive linguists have pushed the boundaries of cognitive linguistics. Conversely, a number of critics have changed and challenged cognitive linguistics to go beyond its boundaries. The hypothesis that language is not an autonomous cognitive faculty has implied that conceptual structures and processes proposed for language should be essentially the same as those found in non-linguistic human cognition. At first, this meant that cognitive linguists drew on the results of cognitive psychology and, to a lesser extent, philosophy in developing cognitive linguistic analysis. It also led to the analysis of conceptual structure using linguistic evidence. More recently, the reverse has taken place. Cognitive linguists have applied the conceptual analysis of cognitive linguistics to other cognitive domains. The cognitive linguistic models of metaphor have been applied to literary analysis, Turner, Lakoff, philosophy and ethics, Johnson, Lakoff and Johnson, for sympathetic by critical reviews, Messier, politics, Lakoff, and mathematics, Lakoff. Blending theory has been applied to a general theory of mind, human culture, and the evolution of new humankind, Turner, Foucault, and Turner. These forays outside of linguistics are ambiguous and highly controversial, but if the first hypothesis is valid, then there should be more implications from the results of cognitive linguistic analysis for non-linguistic cognition. The hypothesis that grammar is conceptualization, as well as the other two basic hypotheses, implies a close relationship between cognitive linguistics and cognitive psychology. Indeed, research on categorization was inspired by the work of psychologists such as Roche, and research on construal operations was inspired by the work of the Gestalt psychologists. Most recently, cognitive psychologists have been influenced by cognitive linguistic research. And construction grammar in particular has dovetailed with research in language acquisition. Also, there has been considerable mutual interest between cognitive linguists and those advocating activation network and parallel distributed processing models of language. For example, C. Allman. There is considerable scope for further interaction between cognitive psychology and cognitive linguistics, in particular for critical experimental testing of cognitive linguistic hypotheses and a refinement of the linguistic assumptions beyond the experimental designs of cognitive psychologists. Finally, the hypothesis that a knowledge of language emerges from language use reveals both a weakness and an opportunity for cognitive linguistics to respond to its own critics, who look at language from a different perspective than either cognitive linguists or the generative grammarians and truth-conditional semantics that cognitive linguists were originally responding to. These critics attack all the latter approaches to language for being focused exclusively on the mind of the speaker or hearer and ignoring the central function of language as communication and the role of social interaction, discourse, and the social structures it presupposes in understanding why language is the way it is. It is true that cognitive linguistics, as its name implies, has focused its attention on mental representations and cognitive processes, and has only recently begun to respond to the discourse and functionalist approaches to language. The hypothesis that knowledge of language emerges from language use provides an opportunity for cognitive linguistics to engage with the social interactional language nature of language. Usage events are, of course, acts of social interaction. Speakers construe their experience for the purpose of communicating that experience to others, which in turn has broader social interactional purposes, and hearers likewise invoke a construal of the utterance for these broader purposes. In sum, cognitive linguistics has the potential to make a contribution to a theory of language that goes beyond cognition, as well as a theory of cognition that goes beyond language.